I was alerted that, reading from an email dated September 2nd, Kate, we may call Dr. DeVere as an educational expert witness attached as her CV. She has not evaluated Philip Chism. And there was a CV attached. On October 5th, I inquired as to the notice of the substance of her proposed educational testimony and was told that Ms. Regan was waiting for the reports, I believe Dr. Kintroff and Dr. Deadley's reports, but let me think about this and that she would get back to me in the morning. On Tuesday, October 6th, I was told the content of Dr. DeVere's testimony is largely dependent on the content of the mental health expert's reports. Generally, she will testify to diagnosis, symptoms, treatment, and course of psychosis in children, how these illnesses are the same or different from illnesses in adults. And Ms. Regan indicated that as soon as she reviewed the report, she would let me know if there was anything additional. On October 11th, she added, apparently, that based on Dr. Kintroff's report, or subject to Dr. Kintroff's report, which we didn't have yet, essentially the early onset of schizophrenia in children was added to the notice. Throughout our exchanges, I was told that Dr. DeVere was solely an educational witness and that she had not evaluated Philip Chism. And I will tell the court frankly that my first two questions on cross, no matter what Dr. DeVere tests to on direct, were going to be whether she'd ever met Philip Chism or whether she'd ever reviewed any records of Philip Chism's. During the break just now, Ms. Regan approached me and informed me that Dr. DeVere reviewed the Boston Medical Center records as well as the Worcester Recovery records, I believe, from June of 2014. This is the first time hearing about it. In my experience, an educational witness should not review any records. It permits them to dovetail their testimony to the symptoms of the defendant. I had frankly intended to ask for some limitation on her testimony with respect to schizophrenia, but other than that, I had no objections to her testimony as an educational witness. But I'm now faced with, once again, having my cross-examination badly hamstrung by I can't ask a question that is a completely fair question because the answer is going to be that she reviewed some records that I learned about literally within the last 10 minutes.
Well, the records that you'd have to inquire of on cross-examination, though, would be radioactive records, wouldn't they?
Yes.
All right. Well, first of all, Ms. Regan, I'll hear from you on the notice issue relative to this witness, Dr. DeVere, is now being more than a teaching expert.
Your Honor, I do not intend to call Dr. DeVere other than as a teaching expert. About 2 years ago, she did review records of Philip Chism from Boston Medical Center and from the Worcester Recovery Center. At this time, she has no present memory of those records.
All right.
But she did look at them, and I don't intend, I mean, her testimony is clearly as an educational expert.
All right, because I think you need to interrupt her if she says something that's going to open up the door to June 14th. It's not your, I know it's not your nature, but you're just going to have to put your hand up and stop her mid-sentence if she does something that's going to open up a cross-examination inadvertently. Paul, they can start to gather. And otherwise, this will just be the analogy I think I made was to, in the child sexual abuse cases, so that there not be any vouching, that there be no connection to the defendant in the case. Was there any issue that you had that'll save the sidebar, Ms. McDougall, because you said that you might have an issue?
Well, Your Honor, I'm very concerned at this point about the notice I've been given about her testimony because I don't know what's going to come out of her mouth based on... the last thing I want to be doing is standing up here or approaching sidebar on issues of disclosures at this point in a trial. It is not something the Commonwealth takes any pleasure in. But I have a brief paragraph that has changed. I've just learned, yes, it is exactly the same as the child abuse context, which is why I wasn't objecting. I can't fathom that the Commonwealth be entitled to call an expert who had reviewed the victim's records in a child sexual abuse case. So it's not, because she's been allowed to review records in this case that, as the court has pointed out, are dynamite. The Commonwealth has moved heaven and earth not to go anywhere near that, in an abundance of caution.
So here's the problem. The problem is it's on the defendant, not the Commonwealth. That's why I told Ms. Regan to be rude if she has to be rude, to stop, because if they open the door, they open the door.
I don't want them to open the door. So the person who's truly hamstrung is the Commonwealth.
Well, you don't want them to open the door for reasons having,
Because it's a door I would never walk through.
No,
Because the SJC would judge me very harshly for walking through
well,
that door.
that's the point I'm making, is that if it opens, it opens. I can't imagine that Ms. Regan is going to ask a question that's going to allow that door to open. Well, the request, I guess, is that because she reviewed the record, she shouldn't testify?
I've had 5 minutes to think about it, and that
Okay.
obviously has implications that are concerning to me.
It's
But
more concerning than the defendant opening the door. Here's my take.
The defendant's error, the defendant's failure, once again, is only going to hamstring the Commonwealth. The fact that she has to be careful about asking about June of 2000.
Hold on, let me ask you this, because, just hold on 1 minute. The problem is this. The problem is that if she testifies differently than the disclosure because of what she reviewed, then the 614 incident is going to be available for cross-examination. So, there's two possibilities here. There's three possibilities. The third one I'm not going to do, which is to spend time augmenting what I already said about handwrite and case versus Lang. So that's one option I'm not going to do. Another option is that she testify according to the disclosure analogous to a child abuse case, where, as you said, the Commonwealth, according to the doctrine, has to, with kid gloves, make sure that the expert in no way has any contact with the alleged victim so that there's no vouching. And that's the analogy here as a teaching expert. Now, you've made your point, and putting aside, because it doesn't do any good this moment, but I've already made my comments that I've made concerning disclosures in case and handwrite. The issue now is on the record that this has happened because of the defendant's making. There's two possible rulings here. One ruling is she doesn't testify. The other ruling is if she testifies and opens the door to 614, she opens the door. Let me just tell you, it seems to me that the situation has arisen because of the defendant's choices, and it seems to be that number two is a lot easier to argue. Hold on 1 minute. Hold on just 1 minute. Hold on 1 second. Number two is a lot easier to argue than excluding a teaching expert should there be conviction.
Except number two is a door I'm never going to walk through.
Well,
So I will not be forgiven by this SJC for introducing evidence that will ultimately lead to a prior identical incident. So there is no number two for the Commonwealth, because I'm not going to do that. And I should never have been put in this position.
well, if it comes out on direct, that's your choice, because I don't think being in the business of predicting what the SJC is going to do is an easy thing to do. But if it opens, it opens. And the defendant has strong reason for it not to open. And this is a box built by the defendant. So if this expert does anything beyond what was noticed as a teaching expert, then the implications are the implications. But I don't see this is what I'm saying. I got two choices here. I think the not allowing the expert to testify is a more precarious choice than the defendant calling the witness, having them review records, tying those records or any testimony to this case, and opening the door to an incident that would otherwise be inadmissible. And so I am forced to make a choice between two untenable positions, and in making a choice between two untenable positions, I'm choosing the one that I think is more likely, should there be a conviction, to be understood than the other.
I would ask that Ms. Regan put on the record exactly what Dr. DeVere has reviewed so that I am not forced with not knowing. I would additionally also ask to be heard unrelated on the issue of the extent to which she can testify regarding the presentation, diagnosis, and treatment of early onset schizophrenia in children in the absence of any testimony that Mr. Chism has schizophrenia.
All right. No, have them, so you want to be heard right now on the issue of what the offer of proof is as it relates to schizophrenia?
Sure.
Okay. What's the offer of proof? We can hold in there for one more second. Okay. Ms. Regan, what's the offer of proof?
Psychotic, not otherwise specified, also known as unspecified schizophrenia spectrum, and other psychotic disorder. This category applies to presentations in which symptoms characteristic of a schizophrenic spectrum and other psychotic disorders but are present but don't meet the full criteria for any of the disorders in the schizophrenia spectrum. The unspecified schizophrenia spectrum and other psychotic disorder category is used in situations in which the clinician chooses not to specify the reason that the criteria are not met for a specific schizophrenia spectrum or other psychotic order. Psychotic symptoms occur in children, and they often are a prodromal stage of schizophrenia. Psychosis in children and youth occur as part of depression, bipolar, and schizophrenic spectrum disorder. The symptoms of early onset schizophrenia have been testified to by the experts in this case. Delusions, hallucinations, disorganized thinking, we heard about that from Dr. Dudley and from Dr. Jackson, and negative symptoms, withdrawal, impairment of functioning.
And you understand as it relates to that point that there can't be reference to that in the questions. What's the name of this expert again? I apologize.
Dr. DeVere.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I can't remember. Dr. DeVere. You can't reference, in this case, has been.
Right. I understand that completely, and I intend to stay completely away from it. But what she's going to do is give the landscape of psychosis in children and young teenagers and what they look for, what's important, and what it's likely to be, and why the diagnosis is not otherwise specified, and also how psychosis presents itself in children and young teens.
And it's the Boston, and I know you're not going to reference any questions related to Boston Medical Center or Worcester Recovery, but are those the only two areas of records that she reviewed?
I'm not sure. She may have reviewed records concerning, no, those are the only two records that she reviewed.
Okay. All right. Are you all set, Ms. McDougall?
Dr. Dudley's still here, by the way.
But, I don't think there was, is there any recross?
No.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. There's two choices I have.
I'm aware of what the choices are, Your Honor, and
Do you need to be heard further? That's all I'm asking.
I would ask for 5 minutes to speak to Ms. O'Sullivan.
Can you have the jury go back for a moment, please?
I don't believe so, Your Honor.
All right, but you want 5 minutes, right? All right. Court will be in a short recess. It's not that I don't know how to tell time. It's that we're moving toward the end of the trial, and as we move more and more to the end of the trial, you'll find more time in the jury room than waiting than you'll find in the courtroom. That's just normal. Okay, next witness, please, Ms. Regan.
The defense would call Dr. DeVere.
Doctor, you're going to follow me. Doctor, if I could ask you to stop here, turn to face the clerk, she'll swear you in.
Right here.
No,
Would you
right there.
stop right there? Just raise your right hand for me, please. Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give in the cause now in hearing shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? You may be
Come up.
seated.
Doctor, make yourself comfortable. Before we begin, could you faces, you may be seated. And faces on the appropriate men. Good morning, Doctor. In a motion to sequester witnesses in the case, all that means is until the evidence is over, you can only be in the courtroom when you're testifying. You can't talk about your testimony to the other witnesses, or let them talk about theirs. Thank you. Ms. Regan, please.
Dr. DeVere, could you state your first and last name and spell them, please?
My first name is Yael, that's Y-A-E-L. My last name is DeVere, that's D-V-I-R.
And are you a doctor?
Yes, I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist, an MD.
And are you licensed to practice medicine in Massachusetts?
I am.
Now, do you have board certifications?
Yes, I'm double boarded in general psychiatry and in child and adolescent psychiatry.
And what's your current employment?
I'm an assistant professor at the University of Massachusetts Medical School, where I direct the mood and psychotic disorders clinic at the Center for Autism and Neurodevelopmental Disorders. And I also am a teaching faculty at the University Medical School.
Now, can you tell us about the clinic that you're a director of?
It is a consultation clinic that does consultations and evaluations on complex youth, where the question of major mental illnesses, mood disorders, and psychotic illnesses is in question. I usually see youth 2 to 3 times in consultation. I've started doing this work with Dr. Frazier, who's the Division Chief of Child Psychiatry at UMass.
Now, you have never met Philip Chism, correct?
Correct.
And you have no opinion about Philip Chism's mental health, correct?
Correct.
And it's your understanding your testimony here today is just in a general sense, correct?
Correct.
Now, where did you go to medical school?
I went to medical school at Hadassah Medical School, Hebrew University of Jerusalem, in Jerusalem, Israel.
Now, where did you do your residence?
I did my residency and my child and adolescent fellowship at the University of Massachusetts.
And you finished your fellowship in about 2009?
Yes.
Now, do you belong to professional organizations?
I do.
And could you tell us the professional organizations you belong to? Some of them anyway.
I belong to the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry and the New England I'm trying to remember the acronym there. It's the New England branch of ACAP. I belong to the APA, the American Psychiatric Association, ADAMSEP, which is the Association of Directors in Medical Student Education. I've been a member of a few other organizations in the past, but not currently.
Are you the editor of any peer-reviewed journals?
I co-edited an issue of Child and Adolescent Clinics of North America on psychosis in youth in 2013. And I am a peer reviewer for other journals.
And those include Academic Psychiatry, Harvard Review of Psychiatry.
Yes.
Now, you teach?
I do. I direct the medical student clerkship, which is the 3rd-year course for medical students, and I also teach in the Child and Adolescent Fellowship.
And have you actually had peer-reviewed publications yourself?
I do.
And could you tell us some of those publications?
So in the issue that I described, I had 2 articles that I wrote myself. I had other publications related to mood disorders and trauma, other related to co-occurring autism spectrum disorders and psychosis.
Have you written chapters in books?
I have.
And could you tell us what chapters in books you've written?
This is a number of years back. I'm trying to remember the title of the textbook. It was a 3-volume series on psychosis and schizophrenia in general.
Was it a handbook of schizophrenia spectrum disorders?
Yes, yes.
And you wrote 2 chapters?
Yes, I co-wrote 2 chapters, one on early onset schizophrenia and one on the treatment of that condition.
Now, could you tell us what psychosis is?
Psychosis is a syndrome, meaning that it's a constellation of symptoms that come together. You can divide it into looking at the positive symptoms, which include hallucinations, which are sensory experiences that are not actually occurring for every other person in the world. Delusions, which are thoughts that do not have base in reality, and disorganized thinking or speech. There are also negative symptoms, which include decreased functioning and decreased social functioning in general.
Now, does psychosis occur in children?
Psychosis does occur in children.
And can you explain?
So psychosis is a syndrome, a set of symptoms, and it can be part of a number of disorders and diagnoses. It is not uncommon in very young children and can be actually part of normal development up to about the age of 6. However, after that age, those experiences are generally not part of normal development. And in school age, those symptoms usually are a sign of a more significant mental illness. Psychosis in children is more commonly part of more common conditions, such as mood disorders, can be a result of anxiety disorders, can be comorbid or co-occurring with either trauma-related illnesses or developmental issues like autism spectrum disorder. However, in childhood, psychotic illnesses that are a primary psychotic process still occur. In childhood, meaning before puberty, under the age of 13, they're quite rare, but they do occur. Estimated about 1 in 10,000, and after the age of 13, they're much more common, about 0.5%. And we know that for actually about half of adults who end up with a diagnosis of a schizophrenia spectrum disorder, those symptoms began in adolescence. And so the usual age of onset of those illnesses, of schizophrenia spectrum illnesses, is in later adolescence toward the mid-20s and 30s. But while rare, they do occur in childhood. They can be much more complicated to diagnose and to treat in childhood. Kids are complicated, their language is still developing. All those things have to be taken into consideration when assessing a child.
Now, what is psychotic disorder not otherwise specified? Does it have a new name?
Psychotic disorder not otherwise specified is the term used in the DSM-4, which is the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual 4, and that was replaced in 2013 teen by DSM-5, which is a newer version. And psychosis NOS now has a longer name, and I'm not sure I think it's schizophrenia spectrum disorder and psychosis not otherwise specified, or something of that effect. But what's important is this is there to be able to capture significant psychosis where some of the criteria necessary to actually make the diagnosis of schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder are unavailable to the evaluator, or some of the details are missing.
Now, is this diagnosis useful in evaluating children and young teens?
It is very useful, and it is frequently used. Given the complexity of assessment and diagnosis in youth, frequently mental health professionals do not use a more specified diagnosis because things are still evolving and symptoms might be changing. And it is a way to mark that there is a significant concern leaning towards this area, but not all of the information is available, either because it wasn't being collected or because it hasn't occurred yet.
Now, does a psychotic disorder not otherwise specified, or rather an unspecified schizophrenia spectrum or other psychotic disorder, how is that related to actual early onset schizophrenia?
I would say that in many cases where eventually a youth or young adult are diagnosed with schizophrenia or schizophrenia spectrum disorder, sometime in the years before that diagnosis was made, the diagnosis that they carried was psychosis NOS.
What is schizophrenia?
Schizophrenia is a chronic brain illness. So it's a biological illness. And if you use the DSM definitions for schizophrenia, there is a list of symptoms that have to be present, and there is a timeline that those symptoms have to be present. And it is an illness that is characterized by episodes of more acute psychosis and then impairment that occurs between those episodes.
Do all individuals with schizophrenia appear alike?
No, it's quite a heterogeneous group of disorders, and we see a variety of presentations.
And in people that are eventually diagnosed with schizophrenia, at what age do the psychotic symptoms first appear?
So the majority of people are diagnosed between late teens and early adulthood into the mid-20s. They initially have a prodromal phase that can last a number of years, where they have symptoms that are non-specific symptoms, and there can be general deterioration in their functioning or social functioning. Those young people tend to isolate themselves. There might be a significant decline in school function on top of the socializing functioning, and then other things that might continue to happen are irritability, odd or unusual behaviors, and only later on there may be additional delusional thinking.
Now, what is early onset schizophrenia?
Early onset schizophrenia is defined as the onset of schizophrenia before the age of 18 and after the age of 13.
And do you see cases of early onset schizophrenia in your clinic?
I do.
Now, what is very early onset schizophrenia?
Very early onset schizophrenia is the onset of schizophrenia before the age of 13, before puberty.
And do you see cases of that in your clinic?
I do.
But not often.
It's quite a rare condition.
Now, can hallucinations, delusions, and disorganized thoughts occur in healthy children?
As I said, hallucinations can occur in healthy children without any illness before the age of 6. After the age of 6, that is not usually part of a normal development. It can be part of other biological brain conditions. It can be part of other mental health diagnoses, such as depression. Delusions do not occur in healthy children at all, and can occur in children with psychosis, whether it's related to affective illnesses such as bipolar disorder and depression, or in kids who later on develop schizophrenia.
Now, how does psychosis present itself in children under 13 and under?
The onset of very early onset schizophrenia or childhood onset schizophrenia is an insidious onset, meaning that the impairments are slow to progress and frequently are not recognized by the adult in the child's life until much time has passed. It is likely a more homogeneous type of illness compared to the early onset, the later onset of illness. Those children, because of where they are developmentally, tend to have much less complex delusions that are much less developed than those that you would see in older people with the same illness. They have hallucinations. Auditory hallucinations are the most common, but in young children before 13, they can also have visual and tactile and many other forms of hallucinations. There are some kids, but not all of the kids, that have premorbid developmental problems, but that is not the case in all of those youth.
Now, you had talked about positive and negative symptoms as concerns schizophrenia and schizophrenia spectrum diseases. Can you explain what the positive symptoms are?
Positive symptoms are the hallucinations, the delusions, and the disorganized speech and thinking.
And the negative symptoms?
And the negative symptoms are decreased functioning, decreased socializing, and just decreased ability to function within the social and academic demands.
How does psychosis present itself in children 13 and over?
It's much more similar to the adult illness of schizophrenia or adult psychoses. Many times the content is directly related to the adolescent's life. And so there are more auditory hallucinations compared to a variety, and there are more delusions, although depending on where the child is developmentally, these might also be less complex.
Now, we've used age 13 as a cutoff. Is that a gradual cutoff, or is that an abrupt cutoff in what you see?
It is not an abrupt cutoff, and it's just an agreed upon marker of puberty, which is a process that involves brain changes and hormonal changes in the body causing brain changes. But it also can be a time that causes change in presentation for people who were starting to exhibit symptoms before 13.
Now, how do you go about evaluating whether a child or young teen suffers from a psychotic disorder and or schizophrenia?
So an interview with the youth and with the family is the most important part of the assessment. It is important to review as many records as possible, get collateral information from teachers and anybody else who has known this youth. Usually it is also helpful to do a medical workup and rule out a number of potential medical conditions that could also present themselves with psychosis. You can use psychological testing to help, but that's not diagnostic.
Now, do you consider family history?
Yes, family history is part of the general history that has to be evaluated, and it's an important factor.
Now, can you explain further what you look for in a family mental health history?
So we know that family history of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and schizoaffective disorder is more common in children with childhood onset schizophrenia. It's also more common in youth with early onset schizophrenia.
And other psychotic disorders?
Yes.
Now, you mentioned psychological tests. Can you, do you use psychological tests when you are evaluating a child?
So I do not perform neuropsychological or psychological testing in youth. That is not part of my training. That's a neuropsychologist's job, but I do read the assessments and look for clues there. Important is to look at the general intellectual abilities of the youth and to look at any language dysfunction to see if that can possibly explain some of the conditions. Some people use projective testing, which can sometimes elicit some of the psychotic symptoms, especially if the youth is not sharing those with his environment. But that is not, if that does not exist in the testing, that does not mean that schizophrenia can't be a diagnosis. It really is just one other tool and clue.
What is the course of schizophrenia in children and young teens?
So schizophrenia in general is a chronic illness, and it has acute exacerbations, and between those there can be a return to some level of stability. Usually every exacerbation leads to a general decline in the youth's in any patient's function. Sadly, schizophrenia in children and in adolescents is a more severe form of the illness, so generally the course is more severe. They tend to have a general lower function even between those acute episodes.
Is that always the case?
It's not always the case. There can be young people who are able to continue with studies and able to continue in achieving high school diploma, going on to college. So there is a big variation of what people are able to do. The pre-morbid intelligence is usually something that you can look at. So if a young person starts with a higher intellectual ability, they tend to function better in between the episodes compared to somebody who starts already having some deficits.
Now, what is an acute I can't say it. What's an acute episode?
An acute episode. So it is mostly a significant increase in the positive symptoms, so in the hallucinations, the delusions, and the disorganization. So to some degree, those can still remain at the baseline level of function between the episodes, but during the period of the exacerbation or the acute episode, there is an increase in those symptoms.
How long can children or young teens have the illness before an acute episode?
It can be years.
And what can bring on an acute episode?
Nothing at all. An acute stress can definitely do that as well. We know that in adults, things like immigration increase the risk. We know that in transition age youth, that is, older teens and young 20s, transitioning into college can cause what we call first episode psychosis, or first break. And in younger kids, any major life transition can definitely be a stressor that can kind of push that youth over the edge.
How does a child or young teen appear to others when they're in an acute episode?
Bizarre, out of control, not making sense.
Does an acute episode come on suddenly or gradually?
There is a gradual increase in positive symptoms, but sometimes at some point over the course of a couple of days, there can be a significant increase or some kind of event that actually brings the youth into care.
When a child or young teen is entering an acute episode, can the negative symptoms increase as well?
They can. The negative symptoms are a lot easier for the surrounding people to ignore, and the positive symptoms really are quite pronounced, and so usually what the surrounding adults will notice are the positive symptoms, but generally all of the symptoms worsen.
Why are the negative symptoms easier for adults to ignore?
Well, they look like many other things. Because of the time that this usually happens, it could just look like a teenager spending more time in his room, or having a difficult transition to high school and not being able to find friends. There might be suspicion that they started using substances, and that's what's causing their change in behavior. The other thing is, those are not necessarily symptoms that a youth shares with adults around them. So it's very hard for adults to understand what's the internal experience for the child. In general, adults are much better at noticing disruptive behaviors rather than internal experiences. You don't know if you don't ask, and if you don't hear it from the youth.
Now, do these acute episodes end gradually or suddenly?
So in the majority of cases, an acute episode is such a severe and significant event that at that point the youth is brought into treatment. Because the youth is brought into treatment, usually if they respond to treatment, there is improvement in some of those symptoms. Youth can be quite guarded about some of their symptoms, and after sort of a short burst of things that the environment can see, can go back to not sharing and holding on to the experience.
How long does an acute episode last?
An acute episode can last anything between hours to days to weeks.
Now, how long do children and young teens suffer with the illness before adults around them notice?
Sustained cause for speculation, state of mind of a third person.
How long can children or young teens suffer with the symptoms of this disease before it comes to the attention of the adults in their lives?
Sustained. How long could this be going on before it would manifest itself?
It could be years.
Thank you. How do children and young teens experience this illness?
They generally are not aware that something unusual is happening to them, but it can be a scary experience, and they might be afraid to share it with people around them.
And how do children and young teens manage their illness? What means do they use to cope?
So some youth are much better than other youth in being able to manage symptoms and actually continue to function. Kids can use distraction. Some youth use headphones and music to quiet down voices if that's part of their experience. Some keep themselves very busy.
Now, when you diagnose psychoses in a child, do you report it to the National Institute of Health?
No.
Now, are the brains of children and young teens with schizophrenia likely to be different from those without it?
So this is a research question. So there is research, there is neuroimaging research in youth with schizophrenia and in adults with schizophrenia. And in general, what we know is that they're...
Sustained.
May be heard at sidebar?
Sure. Sure.
Has research shown that the brains of people with schizophrenia are different?
Objection.
Sustained.
Is schizophrenia a physical illness as well as a mental illness?
Schizophrenia is a brain illness. It manifests itself in behavior, but it is a brain illness.
Are there physical manifestations of schizophrenia in the brain?
Objection.
Sustained based on the court's, sustained based on the court's previous rulings,
May I have
not
a
on the
moment?
qualifications.
May I have a moment?
Sure.
Thank you very much, Dr. DeVere.
Good afternoon, Dr. DeVere. Dr. DeVere, when you talk about this acute stage of the illness, is that something that could go on with for years without a... Let me start all over. If a child had reached the point where they were having the acute stage of the illness, is that something you would expect a caretaker from miss over a period of years, or do you just mean the sort of lead-up symptoms?
Lead-up symptoms, the prodromal phase is easily missed. A child can also go on to have quiet hallucinations and delusions for quite a long time. Usually when the hallucinations and delusions significantly increase, and there is also an addition of disorganized speech pattern or behavior, usually people around notice. It depends on the state of the adults in the child's life and how attuned they are to what is going on for them. At that point, I would imagine that teachers or adults that come in close contact would notice that there is something that isn't right.
And there's nothing about this acute stage where you have auditory hallucinations that are really becoming disruptive for the individual that necessarily involves violence. Is that fair to say?
It does not necessarily involve violence, no.
And let me just ask you to assist us a little bit in just defining, there's a difference between schizoaffective disorder and schizophrenia, isn't that correct?
That's correct.
Can you just explain what each thing is, please?
Schizoaffective disorder, or maybe I should start with what schizophrenia is. So schizophrenia is an illness where there are positive symptoms and negative symptoms. The positive symptoms that person has to have are at least one of the three following: hallucinations, delusions, or disorganized thoughts. Disorganized behavior is another symptom. These should be occurring for about a month, or if they're less than a month, require acute treatment, and there is about a 6-month period of negative symptoms, which is the general decline in function. Schizoaffective disorder is where there are also mood episodes that are part of the person's illness, and this can be schizoaffective disorder, depressive type or bipolar type. So it's almost like there is one on top of the other. And for a diagnosis of major depressive episodes, there need to be a certain amount of depressive symptoms in a certain period of time. For a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, there is depressive episodes and manic episodes. Schizoaffective disorder is an illness where in between those mood episodes, there still is psychosis. So whereas major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder are both episodic illnesses with a return to baseline without psychotic symptoms, in schizoaffective disorder there is also a period of time in between them where there are psychotic symptoms. That's because in major depressive disorder and in bipolar disorder, psychotic illnesses can occur as part of the mood episode.
Okay. And you've talked a lot, or you've talked some about, well, let me ask you this. There's been a lot of research into people who are ultimately diagnosed as adults with schizophrenia, and then looking back to see if we can look for any sort of predictives about who's likely to become schizophrenic. Is that correct?
There is research into that.
And then by the same token, then there are attempts, so obviously the effort is to catch someone who's going to develop full-blown schizophrenia as early as possible, to get them treated as early as possible, ideally before they go off to college and have their first break. Is that fair to say?
It is fair to say.
But one of the challenges is that while you can look at schizophrenics and look back and see that a very high percentage of them have a certain series of symptoms that lead up to their diagnosis, those same symptoms aren't as predictive of schizophrenia. Does that make sense?
You're talking about the prodromal phase.
Yes.
And youth that are at risk of developing schizophrenia.
So let me,
And in
I'm just going to
hindsight-
stop you for 1 second and have you define the prodromal phase for the jury.
Okay. So what I was going to say, a prodromal phase by name is something that you can really only accurately diagnose in retrospect, looking back and saying this is where this is going. But there is also another term that we use, which is sort of at-risk state, where there are several warning signs and reasons to be more concerned about the direction that this youth might be going into.
And disagree with me if this is your area of expertise. But one of the difficulties in this research, in the effort to look forward, to catch kids at the front end, is that there are kids who have that sort of warning phase symptoms who never develop schizophrenia.
Yes, there are kids that have those warning signs that don't develop schizophrenia. The majority of them do end up having significant mental health concerns.
Okay. But not necessarily schizophrenia.
Not necessarily schizophrenia, sometimes schizoaffective, sometimes other mood disorders.
And what's included in the early warning phase? What kinds of symptoms are you
So
looking for?
there is a progression of the whole phase, and I would say that the phase of illness where you have quite nonspecific symptoms such as social withdrawal and decreased functioning and irritability and maybe things that look like increased anxiety and depression and maybe more involvement with substance use are less specific and can be part of many other things. When youth start to develop unusual thinking, that is, even when it's not a full-blown psychotic break, that is more leaning towards a schizophrenia illness in the future.
And what do you characterize as, I'm sorry, I don't want to miss you, what word did you just use for the thinking? Abnormal thinking, is that what you said?
Possibly, I'm
Okay.
sorry.
Well, in terms of the additional symptom that sort of starts to carry us from non-specific symptoms that could take place in a number of situations more into the likelihood of developing a major mental illness, how do you characterize that kind of thinking? What would it involve?
So this is challenging, right? Because you can only do this with somebody who comes forward and says something's not right, or their environment says something's not right. It's impossible to characterize abnormal thinking in somebody that hasn't been identified as having a problem. So I think that really changes how we see things. But unusual ideas, beliefs that don't make sense, intense beliefs in areas that are not part of somebody's cultural or religious background, just bizarre thoughts.
Thoughts that if a child is able to express them to someone, and I understand they often aren't, at a minimum it would give someone pause to think, is this normal childhood fantasy or is this a problem?
Is this normal child fantasy, or later on in adolescence, is this some kind of existential thinking, or can I not follow the logic of this?
And you talked about that you can get also, in addition to sort of hallucinations and delusions and decreased functioning, you can get disorganization in thought or speech in a child who's sort of further along that spectrum, heading towards likely having a major mental illness.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
And is there something called word salad that's used?
That is a term in mental status exam
What is word salad?
That is speech that the words do not actually connect to each other and doesn't convey a message.
And once a child is in an acute stage that you've described may well lead to hospitalization or treatment, would you expect the child to be able to interact normally with someone during that phase?
So just word salad is quite
I'm sorry,
in advance.
Forget about word salad.
So,
I've moved on. I'm not trying to confuse you.
An interaction with a child who is having acute symptoms of psychosis can be challenging, but it can happen. It is possible to interact. With a youth, there are also youth that are quite guarded and will not share any of this and can, for briefer periods of time in a conversation, able to suppress and sort of withhold exhibiting any of those symptoms. So it is possible.
Even a child who is having command hallucinations that have reached a stage they can't not do what the command hallucinations tell them to do?
So sometimes they can, for 20, 30 minutes, a lot of people even that are experiencing pretty acute symptoms can seem fairly normal in an interaction with another person. If you let more time pass, usually something will come out, but it is possible, even when somebody is having command auditory hallucinations, not to let anybody know.
For 20 or 30 minutes, and then it gets less over time. Is that correct?
Yes.
They can only keep sort of the reaction at bay for a limited period of time.
Well, I would say that if you're sitting and interviewing somebody, if I would be sitting and interviewing a youth who is having command auditory hallucinations, I would expect that after 30 minutes, more of it will probably seep into the conversation. But in a natural environment where a kid could go to the other room, plug in his iPod and listen to some music, he might be able to do some things that would mask what is going on.
And Dr. DeVere, just to be clear, you've never met Philip Chism.
I've never met him.
You've never treated Philip Chism.
I've never treated him.
Everything you've testified today is just based on your training and experience and completely unrelated to Philip Chism.
Yes.
I have nothing further.
I have no questions.
All right. Thank you, Doctor.
I just need one moment. Thank you,
Sure.
Dr. DeVere.
May we approach sidebar?
Sure. I now can actually tell you when I think you'll get the case. I can't tell you for sure, but I can tell you that you will be a deliberating jury on this case either Thursday of this week or Friday of this week. So you'll get the case this week for your deliberations. I expect I'll have a better sense whether it'll be Thursday or Friday by the end of the day tomorrow. And keep in mind what I told you during the impanelment, which is once you're a deliberating jury, you deliberate until you've reached a verdict. If you haven't reached a verdict by 4 o'clock on any given day, you're released until the next day to continue your deliberations. So we're coming down the home stretch, and you've all been working to the best of your ability very hard. It's obvious how conscientious you've been. I know that you'll continue to comport yourself as you would expect people in the important position you're now in to do so, and to make sure that nobody at any point in time tries to talk about the case with you. And if you see or hear anything, television, radio, or newspaper in your peripheral vision, please immediately divert your attention from it so that you can go into these deliberations with integrity as the sole and exclusive judges of the facts of the case. All right, jurors are excused until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning.
All rise. Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye. All persons having anything further to do before the Honorable David Lowy, Justice of the Superior Court, now sitting at Salem, within and for this county of Essex at present, depart and give your attendance at this place Tuesday morning next at 9 a.m., to which time and place the sitting of this court is now adjourned. Juror, duly done. Court will remain in session. You may be seated.
Okay, counsel. I'll hear you on any outstanding issues, and then we'll not do a charge conference, but a preparation for a charge conference at 2 o'clock. Ms. Oker, why don't you address the issues that you had, please?
Thank you, Your Honor. The first issue is the motion to admit the evidence relating to the consequences of a verdict of not criminally responsible. That is the proposed testimony of the superintendent of Bridgewater State Hospital concerning the conditions of confinement were the defendant to be ordered there. I would propose to admit the testimony of Daniel Kalis. He is now the superintendent of Bridgewater State Hospital, based both on, well, the language and case law going all the way back to Mutina, but most recently reiterated and reinforced in Chappelle as to the importance to the jury's understanding of what the consequences of such a verdict would be. And I know that there's been conversation previously in this case about whether or not commitment to Bridgewater State Hospital is a real possibility for Philip Chism, given his age. And I can't definitively resolve that issue. What I can say is that based on what Deborah Peinel said on the record to the court, and my conversation with Attorney Philip Silva with the Department of Corrections at Bridgewater State Hospital, the position of the Department of Mental Health and the Department of Corrections is that were the court, of course were the court to order him there, that they would accept him there, though no one has any memory of a 16-year-old being at Bridgewater. Nonetheless, they would accept him and one-on-one staff him to deal with the problem of PREA, the federal statute requiring that individuals under the age of 18 be kept separate from individuals over the age of 18 in a prison environment.
Okay, thank you. Ms. McFiddler?
You know, first of all, as a general matter, Your Honor, I would just suggest that the court has spoken very recently on this issue in Chappelle. The Commonwealth is certainly would be asking for and assumes the court will give the instruction in Chappelle. What the cases have made clear is that while it is certainly something appropriate for the court to instruct on, it is not something appropriate for counsel to argue. And by the same token, I would suggest to present evidence is inappropriate. Additionally, in this particular case, as Ms. Oker has just noted, it is far from clear that the defendant would go to Bridgewater, and if this evidence were to be admitted, the Commonwealth would want to admit evidence that he's far more likely he would go to Worcester Recovery, and that there are real concerns about the level of security at Worcester Recovery that have been raised on multiple occasions in this case by the Commonwealth. So, frankly, it's a can of worms. And I just think the court has, where the SJC has literally spoken on this issue mid-trial, we should do what they told us and nothing more.
All right, thank you. I think the whole point of the instruction is to make sure that the jury doesn't think that somebody who's found not to be criminally responsible somehow walks out the door. And the new instruction from Chappelle emphasizes that this commitment can actually turn into a lifetime commitment. And the purpose of that is so that jurors don't misunderstand the implications. But at the same time that that is the case, and the instruction exists for that reason, jurors are also told that they cannot make any decision based on the consequences of their deliberations. They can't take into any account any potential punishment or the consequences of their deliberations. It's more informational. Now, in Chappelle, the language previously in place has been made even stronger, and I think that it's not just a concern about what the rebuttal would be, but it would confuse the jury into thinking that this is really something that they should be discussing and considering as a matter of evidence. That's not the point. The point is that they're not supposed to be considering it. So the request to have the superintendent of Bridgewater testify is denied.
No, my objection, please.
Sure. All right, what else do we have?
There were two pieces of evidence that were taken to Bene on, I believe it was a week ago today. The photograph of Philip Chism and the psychiatric records of his maternal grandmother and maternal aunt, Joyce Barbieri and Michelle Barbieri. So those are loose ends in the evidence.
Okay, so if I understood the Commonwealth's position, the psych records from the maternal grandmother and maternal great aunt or aunt?
It's
Aunt. That the Commonwealth was going to review that to see if there was anything that you wished stricken, and they were admitted to Bene, I think. Is that right?
If we could just have till the morning, Your Honor, we're in the process of doing that. I can tell the court off the top of my head, I know there were some references to his grandmother suffering renewed depression from the fact that her mentally ill grandson was facing charges of rape and murder. Needless to say, the Commonwealth thinks that should be redacted. But I don't know that we have the same extent of objections as we did. We certainly agree that the bulk of them should come in.
So what I'll do is once you've got the Commonwealth's objections, I'll get a list of pages from counsel, please, and go over those. All right. And then the photograph, your position, I assume, is that we've got testimony relative to what age there was an onset from Dr. Dudley, and we have testimony concerning the relationship with the sisters, and that you believe, therefore, the relevance is, even though you would have argued it was relevant before, but that the relevance has changed.
Yes.
Okay, Ms. McDougall, I'll hear you on that.
Your Honor, whatever minimal relevance there is and minimal probative value there is, there's undue prejudice to the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth was provided with a series of pictures of Mr. Chism, frankly some which look far closer in age to the time of the crime and don't include his very cute little sisters. There is only one reason that that photograph is going in. Frankly, I'm not at all clear how old he is in that photograph based on the testimony as well as based on the other photographs we have, some of which are dated and time-stamped, in which he looks substantially younger than those photographs, which are dated 2007, 2008. So I just don't think the foundation's been laid, and the sole purpose for that photograph is to make the defendant seem sympathetic.
All right. Well, if there's a photograph that shows the defendant by himself in the period of time in which he moved from Tennessee, I would allow that. The photograph, for the purposes of this case, doesn't add anything to the testimony from Dr. Dudley of onset at 10. But if there's a photograph that shows the defendant in differently than in the videos or as he's seen by the jury today in the period of time when he moved or around that period of time, I'd allow that in evidence. Okay, so your objection's noted to that, Ms. Oker. Okay, yes.
There is an issue of the records from the Department of Youth Services that concern Philip Chism's medication, and that in fact, after he was discharged on approximately November 4th, 2015 from Worcester Recovery Center, that he has continued to take the medication, the risperidone. The reason that this is relevant, and the court should admit it, is that the Commonwealth opened the door to this with its question about whether on his last day, November 4th at Worcester Recovery Center, if he refused the risperidone. I realize that the court or that the Commonwealth said that that was relevant because he wanted to be in worse shape when he came back to court so he could be incompetent. I think that's what was said at sidebar. But there is a fair inference the jury could make is that he stopped taking the medication because he didn't think he needed it, or because he didn't think he needed it and because it wasn't helping him. And it contributes to their argument that he's a malingerer. Anyway, here are the records, and it shows he refused the medication on a couple of occasions. The second reason why this is relevant is because the jury is going to look at Philip Chism and how he appears in court, and that he appears in his present state. And they have a right to know that he is on medication and that he's presently on medication. So I would move to admit these records. I can submit them to the judge, the court.
All right, well, the evidence cuts both ways, but if there's objections to issues in the records because it's broader than its purpose, then certainly perhaps there could be a stipulation that he's been taking it since and missed a couple days. I'm not sure. That's a strategic choice from the defendant whether you want to put that evidence in. But do you have any objection to the records, Ms. McDougall?
I do, Your Honor. I agreed with Ms. Oker that I wouldn't require a keeper from DYS, so I'm not making any objection on that front. But again, I just don't see what the relevance is of whether he's been taking Risperdal, and particularly since we're not going to get into that even on the Risperdal, we had our little episode on day 2 of trial. So what's the value of whether or not he's on Risperdal?
Well, I think it's I'm not interested in engaging in the craft of advocacy of the defendant, but there's certainly an argument that helps the Commonwealth that he's taking it all these other days and doesn't take it on that particular day. But the defendant wants to put in evidence that he didn't take it that day, but he took it other days.
Well, and then apparently they want to argue that it explains his behavior in court, which is exactly the same as it's been for long before he was on the Risperdal, except for the days that he engaged in other behavior in lockup. Yeah, no, so there's no, I mean, my concern, I understand the court doesn't want to get involved in the craft of advocacy, but given openings and given everything else, I'm very concerned about how this evidence is going to be argued in closing.
I'm not going to argue it in closing.
Yeah, no, so
I'm not going to, let me be really clear since I need to be. I am not going to mention Philip Chism's appearance in court and its relationship to the antipsychotic medication in my closing.
Yeah, no, the relevance of this is pretty straightforward. If counsel wants to enter into a stipulation, considering I'm going to allow the evidence in for the limited purpose that to rehabilitate the cross, again, I'm not sure that it does, but it might do the opposite, but that's a craft of advocacy determination. If there's no stipulation, then I'll admit it de bene, subject to request for redactions. If there's a stipulation, I'll consider it tomorrow. But the evidence is, I wouldn't consider that the jury would use the evidence for the purpose that the Commonwealth is concerned about without expert testimony, but since it's not going to be argued in closing, I don't really have to worry about that. This is simply a response to the cross-examination of not taking the medication on November 4th as it relates to raising malingering issues. So that can be admitted de bene. Okay. Now,
put on the record, for given all of the issues, I know the court had other substantive reasons for sustaining my objections to Dr. DeVere talking about the value of brain scans. I would just note it's also not included in the notice of her testimony.
all right, so Anything else before we do? There was an indication at the sidebar that the defendant wanted to be excused at 2 o'clock. If that's the case, let's do whatever else we can first. Is there anything else, Ms. Regan?
Yes, well, as regards tomorrow, there's a motion in limine involving Dr. Heben's testimony.
Yeah, this is the Albert Hannigan challenge. Is that the one I read?
No, that I was actually referring to, it's more limited. The motion in limine concerning Dr. Heben, and it also applies to Dr. Casey. I didn't realize when I drafted that Dr. Casey would be testifying at all. But that's okay. I'm not complaining about that. Dr. Heben and Dr. Casey were permitted access to Philip Chism to do psychological testing to inform Dr. Kincherf. And the defendant agreed that they could do psychological testing. However, in the reports that were provided, the contact between Dr. Heben and Dr. Casey and Mr. Chism went broader than that. And in fact, Mr. Chism was interviewed by Dr. Heben and by Dr. Casey. And I would move to exclude that as beyond the scope of the court order and violation of the 14b2, which allows the Commonwealth one evaluator, not two. Now, certainly, Dr. Heben and Dr. Casey would be able to testify about observations they made of Mr. Chism during the psychological testing, because that's all part and parcel. That's not what I'm objecting to. What I'm objecting to is any information obtained by Mr. Chism in an interview prior to the psychological testing.
Okay, but I don't, maybe I'm misunderstanding, but the Commonwealth's interest in this must be to explain the testing and explain how Dr. Casey and Dr. Eben got to where they did in their conclusions, and not as it relates to the testing. I mean, Ms. Regan, I don't disagree with what you've said, and it seems to me that that's clearly right, but I can't imagine the Commonwealth is asking questions other than questions so that the testing makes sense. You need background for the testing to make sense. Did you want to ask questions beyond that? I mean, observations and so that the testing makes sense as to how it works?
No, and I'm a little confused, to be honest, because I can't elicit statements of the defendant on direct examination of anyone anyway, and I didn't intend to elicit them from either Dr. Heben or Dr. Casey. The only interviews they conducted were the sort of baseline conversation they need to have with the defendant for purposes of the testing.
Right.
I don't expect to elicit from either of them an opinion or a diagnosis, except to testify to the testing they did, which is the basis of, so that I can admit the testing, so that it can then be a proper basis for Dr. Kincherf's opinion.
All right. I assume that eliminates the problem, and because I don't know how they'd be able to get to their data and what it means without some, not reference to what the answers to any questions were, but did you have a conversation before? Did you explain it? That's all. They can't get another opinion in under 14b2, and I assume that solves the issue, unless the defendant decides to raise something on cross, obviously. Okay, good. Anything else before I do a colloquy and do a recess? How about you, Ms. McDougal?
All right.
Okay. Yeah, please.
Mr. Chisholm, would you please stand and raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear you'll make true answers to such questions that may be put to you by the court or upon instruction, so help you God?
Can you give this to Mr. Austin?
Yes.
So, Mr. Chisholm, I'm going to ask you some questions so I can make sure your decision to give up your right to be present this afternoon is being made knowingly of your own free will and voluntarily. As in every other instance, I am never, through my questions, trying to suggest to you what you should do. That's your decision after having enough time to talk with your lawyers. So don't misunderstand what I'm going to say now. I was trying to talk you into staying or not staying. But the conversation this afternoon is different than a conversation about whether a witness is going to testify or not testify. The conversation this afternoon is about how the court is going to instruct the jury on the law. In other words, that's a much bigger deal than the other times that you requested not to be present. Do you understand that, sir?
Yes.
Okay. And do you understand, sir, that you, if you choose not to be present, you could also be able to hear this afternoon's testimony and, not testimony, excuse me, discussions of law from the lockup area as well. Do you understand that, sir?
Yes.
Okay. And while we talked about other times participating in the trial process when we were having discussions of law and evidence issues, you also have an opportunity to participate and understand in order to assist counsel on your thoughts on closing arguments and any other issues, to be present during any charge conference or even the informal preliminary charge conference that the court's going to have this afternoon. In other words, this is an important thing that's going to happen this afternoon, and you have a right to be here not just to see it, but to talk to your lawyers about it. Do you understand that, sir?
Yes.
Okay. And have you had enough time to, did you speak to Mr. Osler about this, sir?
Yes.
Okay, have you had enough time to talk to him about it?
Yes.
And if you wish not to be present for this afternoon, or do you wish to be present?
Not to be present.
Okay, and are you making this decision knowingly of your own free will and voluntarily?
Yes.
Have I asked you anything at all that's confused you, sir?
No.
Okay. And I know I've already gone over this before, but you understand this is a different type of discussion than when you've requested not to be here before.
Yes.
All right. I find the decision to waive presence, which is the defendant's right, is being made knowingly, freely, and voluntarily upon the advice of competent, qualified, and prepared counsel, and the request is accepted. All right, we'll be in recess until 2 o'clock then.
All rise.